Welcome to our first live event in 16 months. It's exciting. Thrilled to have you here. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Library. We have annual events. We have symposia in the spring and the fall. We have monthly events like the Ford Evening Book Talk that you're at tonight. We have all kinds of surprise events. I'm happy to tell you about a few of them. But mostly, I'm just thrilled to be able to offer conversations like the kind we're having tonight. I'm actually going to sit down with the author and talk to him about his book, this new biography of George Washington. Thrilled to have you here. We also have an audience coming from elsewhere. As we've learned over the last several months, last 16 months, we can build a national audience with our live streams and have a lot of people come in from far, far away. I'm quite confident my mother in Missouri is watching right now. So we can have a national audience. We're excited about these opportunities. But we're also excited about bringing you here to the estate. So thank you for being here. I see many people wearing masks. Absolutely, wear them if you're comfortable. You don't need to, but also we want to make sure that people feel comfortable in these events. And if they don't, they have an opportunity to watch them from home. So we will keep working at that in the months ahead, and we're excited about the kinds of content that we can bring to you. Tonight, we have David O. Stewart, author of a new biography of George Washington called George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father. It's a cradle-to-grave biography that gives us new insights into the man, into the life, into the period of George Washington. I'm also thrilled about some other upcoming events. We have a Ford Evening Book Talk next month in August. Christopher Pearl will come talk to us about his new book on the rise of the revolutionary state. He's focused on Pennsylvania. Many of you may not care about Pennsylvania because we're here in Virginia, but it's a great story of the rise of the new governments coming out of the American Revolution. We also have a couple of events in September that I really want to draw a note to. There's a September 14th event, a book launch event for Nathaniel Philbrick. His new book, Travels with George, and I can't quite remember the subtitle, but it's an exciting book of his understanding of the world in which George Washington lived by traveling to the places to which George traveled. And this book is an exciting one and a good opportunity for us to encounter the latest work of Nathaniel Philbrick. He is going to be coming here. This is the actual book launch event. So this is going to be a ticketed event where you get a signed copy of the book as a part of the cost of attendance. Look on our website for more details about that. And September 22nd, we have our annual Founding Debates event. Partially, this celebrates the anniversary of the Washington Library. We opened in 2013, and we like to have a September celebration of that opening of this new research center for George Washington. But also we like to have a conversation about some contemporary issue. And this year we're going to talk about civic education and what we're learning about what works, what doesn't work, why it's important, what we can do. The Founding Debates, sponsored by the Ammerman Family Foundation, will be on September 22nd. That's a free event. Excited to tell you more about that in the weeks ahead, and also go to our website. But tonight, again, we have David O. Stewart, award-winning author, biographer, historian of the founding period, also an author of historical novels. He knows so much about this period, and he dove into the life of George Washington in a way that I'm excited to explore with him in this conversation. Please join me in welcoming David O. Stewart. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out, watching from home. It's nice to get out and not be staring at my screen.
I think you've done a lot of screen-centered book talks over the last several months. Is that right?
It's been too much.
That's right. Let's dive right in. So I think a lot of people here, particularly in Mount Vernon, but around the world, are familiar with the story of George Washington being named the commander-in-chief in 1775. He shows up to the Congress in his uniform. This is a story we're somewhat familiar with. Let's skip a year back. 1774, he's elected to the First Continental Congress from Virginia. Tell us about that. How does he come to be elected? It seems surprising, I think, for a lot of people who picture him as a general, that he's elected as a legislator. Tell us about this story.
It is really the heart of the story I was trying to tell, so I'm delighted you dove into it. He spent 16 years in the House of Burgesses. He had been a commander of the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War, but then was in civilian life for these 16 years and was very active in local government and colonial government. And initially, he was not much of a figure, and he had trouble finding his way. He was not a formally educated guy to a great degree. He was not, he was shy about it, his lack of formal education, and he also wasn't a great speaker. He had a sort of a weak voice, which was odd for such a large, imposing person, but it was true. And to find his feet in the House of Burgesses took him a few years because it was a place that celebrated oratory. And he found it principally by, this is my version based on looking at the House of Burgesses records, by working harder than anybody else. And that was sort of the key to his whole life at some level. And slowly, his arc of becoming significant in the legislature was shallow for a while. But he, after about 8 or 10 years, he becomes an important figure there. And he begins to outshine the people with greater experience like Richard Henry Lee or the great orators like Patrick Henry. And he always had a gift for commanding trust and respect, and he used that. And by the time you get to 1774, he's had big responsibilities within the House of Burgesses. He's become a great leader in Fairfax County. He was on the county court here, which involved a lot of administrative responsibilities as well as judicial. And he is a significant figure. So when they vote for the delegates to go to the Constitutional Convention, the First Continental Congress, he comes in third, which for us is sort of a surprise. You know, who was he? But it's one of my messages is this guy was a political animal, and that was his job. I mean, he was also running Mount Vernon, but his public job was to be a politician, and he was good at it and was recognized as such. So he goes to the First Continental Congress, and this is the one without a uniform, and he is not recognized much. He's not on the two committees that do all the work, but as near as I can tell, he mostly went to dinner, and he saw all the important people in the Congress, socially, all the people in Philadelphia, and as he always did, he made a great impression on them. So when they come back 8 months later, and he is wearing his uniform, and things are tough. You know, we've had Lexington and Concord. You know, we're going to fight. They're looking for a military figure. They respect this fellow who has impressed them the previous time, and he becomes the unanimous choice. Now, there are political factors in his selection as well, but I think it shows some of his savvy and judgment. I was struck by the wearing the uniform thing. It seemed almost pathetic. You know, it's like
presumptuous, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote in the book, it's like the person who shows up at your party with a guitar and, you know, sort of wants to be asked to sing a song. But nobody, and I read all the letters from the Congress that people sent home to their family. Nobody said there's this strange big guy who's, you know, walking around in a uniform. They all, I think, were reassured by it, which was what he meant to do. I think he meant to demonstrate that he was ready. And he was eager for responsibility and eager to take a major role in the revolution.
So we're going to pass around some cards at some point. If you don't already have them, I don't actually know the order of things, but we want to get your questions. I'll bring them in. Also, questions from the audience around the country will be coming in. That's why I have this iPad here, so that I can have an opportunity to see some of these updated questions from around the country. But one of the things, David, that jumped out to me about your book from the start is this focus on the Burgesses' years. As you've mentioned, it's many more years than he ever serves as a general. He's serving as a legislator in the House of Burgesses, the historic, important Virginia representative body. maybe a window into understanding that period has something to do with hogs running at large in Winchester. And this is an episode in your book that just stuck with me, and I want you to share it as best you can. Hogs in Winchester, Virginia. How does this help us understand George Washington as a legislator?
I found it wonderful as a story because my version of his life is that he was a lifelong learner and self-improver, and this felt like a really good example of it. It's within the first couple of years that he is in the House, and he's representing Winchester in Frederick County. That's his constituency, because he owned land out there and could run for office and not run against the Fairfax. There was this bill that he brought in to stop the running of hogs. When hogs run through your town without supervision, they tear up your garden and they go into your stored food and they relieve themselves wherever they wish, and it's unpleasant. And so it seems pretty slam dunk would be a current term, a pretty easy piece of legislation, but it fails. And somebody, I think it was the Speaker of the House, took pity on him or wanted to teach him a lesson and transferred the bill to Edmund Pendleton, who was a contemporary of Washington's, but a very smart lawyer and someone Washington respected. And Pendleton takes over the bill. He rechristens it. It's a great rebranding story. He calls it an environmental bill to preserve the water quality in Winchester, because of course all that pig waste is seeping down into people's wells, and it sails through. And it seemed to me it was Washington had to be mortified at some level that, this was taken away from him and it was an easy bill, you would have thought, and he couldn't do it. But he also went to school on it, as he did on everything, and he didn't have a misstep like that again. He learned that you have to prepare the ground, you have to talk to people and figure out who's going to support you and who might actually not support you, and deal with them and build a coalition. And he took that to heart, and his further activity in the House never involved that kind of misstep. He always was able to get his reports approved, get his the things he was endorsing through. And of course, as president, he was extremely skillful at that.
So with the Burgess's years, we're starting in 1758. And of course, George Washington's life has this epical period before that in the mid-1750s, from the 1752 and beyond, where Washington is learning the experiences of the frontier, the French and Indian War, but also I think he's learning a lot about politics, because he's also dealing with commanding officers in ways that help him or hurt him. Talk to us about the French and Indian War period of George Washington's life in a political context. What does he learn politically out of those years? He learns a lot militarily. What does he learn politically?
Well, politically, I think what he learns is that he was doing things very wrong in two respects. One was, and he was wonderful at this in the Revolutionary War, but he had trouble dealing with the fact that civilians actually were superior to him. And the royal governor expected Washington to treat him with respect and to listen to what he said and to, act accordingly. And Washington was not good at that as a young man. And he's a very young man when he's doing this. He's 23, 24, 25. And a lot of us are not that smart then. And we tell ourselves we get smarter, and we hope that's true. So when he was unhappy, and this was an unhappy time, he's on the frontier fighting Indians. The Indians are way better at frontier warfare than the Virginians ever will be. And so it's basically 3 years of failure. And he takes that on, he takes that to heart. And he's, the settlers are getting slaughtered. His men are getting slaughtered. They're deserting. It's just a bad time. And he's very frustrated, and he lashes out at the governor. Now, this is not smart. The governor is in charge, and he is not. So he alienates a man who actually gave him the job. At the same time, he has to deal with the British military structure, which he was, part of the British military establishment at the time. And he actually got along with General Braddock, who, of course, came to a terrible end outside what is now Pittsburgh at the Battle of Monongahela. But the successor, General Forbes, Washington managed to alienate very completely. He tried to jumped the chain of command a few times and got caught at it. It's not always a good idea, but it's a terrible idea if you get caught at it. He realized by 1758 he's not going to have a career in this British military. They don't like him and they don't respect him. And that's, I think, when he makes the decision that he is going to transition to a political life. Now, politics was sort of in his family. Two of his elder brothers had been in the House of Burgesses. His grandfather and his great-grandfather had, but none had been very prominent. And, George Washington always intended to be prominent.
1758 is also an important year in Washington's life in a personal sense.
Yes.
And I see a really exciting chapter in your book about his emerging relationship with Martha Dandridge Custis. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this. This jumped out at me, but take it however you'd like, where you attempt to describe what it is that Martha would have seen in George Washington that made her trust him as the right person to connect with. And I'm just curious, your read of how Martha understood George in this time in 1758.
It's such a difficult thing to do because to sort of pierce this relationship, because none of their correspondence survives except a couple of scraps. And that was the deal at the time between many married couples, which was, you can be a historical figure, but not what you write to me. And she she had been married to an extraordinarily rich man, Daniel Parke Custis, and he was considerably older and dies of a fever, which happened a good deal, and left her with two small children and oodles of money. And she had her pick. There were other suitors at the time. One historian pointed out that one of the suitors had 10 children and might not have been that appealing as a suitor. But Washington comes calling, and as near as we can tell, he basically wins her over 2 weekends, which is good, fast work and good work. And so that intrigued me. He was a fine looking specimen, physical specimen. She was small, 5 feet barely, and so he's more than a foot taller. He has got a sense of self-possession, which everyone comments on who meets him. Even from a young age, he had this, what John Adams called the gift of silence, which was a gift John Adams didn't have. And he, I think, always had this talent for inspiring trust, and he clearly did it with her. She is not only looking for a husband, and in those days, whoever you married, if you were a widow, was going to take all your money. I mean, that was the deal. That was the law. So it needed to be someone she trusted, not to be a ne'er-do-well, not to gamble it away. This person would be a stepfather to her children, and she was a very devoted mother. So she had to see him as a responsible person. And he was very eminent, although struggling in his military responsibilities in ways most outside people wouldn't know. Here he was, a 27-year-old guy who was commander of the Virginia Regiment. That was impressive. And I think, he was the best dancer at every ball he went to. And he had positives. And I think there is in Washington's attitudes a hard-headedness about marriage that he writes letters to his granddaughters about this, or his step-granddaughters, and ask yourself if your friends will approve of your mate. And when I first read that, I was put off by it, but then I sort of thought, well, actually, it's not a bad question. So I think for both of them, there is the whiff of a transaction to it. But they seem to have been a very sort of devoted couple. So transactions often work out.
So I've got our first question coming in from the audience abroad. Eugenia Burks on YouTube is curious about that first question that I asked you. I mentioned George Washington being elected to the first Continental Congress, and then again, of course, in the second. And she's curious who elected him. How does this work? What was the process for electing someone to the Continental Congress? Is it the House of Burgesses? Is it a broader election than that? Talk to us a little bit about the process in creating these first national governments.
Well, that's a great question, actually, because it was sort of an outlaw operation. The first Continental Congress, I believe, was the House of Burgesses. They were still in existence. But then the royal governor at the time became so annoyed with their flirtation and ultimately devotion to independence that he prorogued them and sent them home, and they didn't have any formal existence, and they could not actually exist. But the speaker, Peyton Randolph, who was a much respected figure, just called them into session, just on his word, which was more respected at the time than the governor's was. And it's often referred to as the Virginia Convention, because it was not a formal body. It had no legal status. It had no legal authority. But I think that was true in a lot of the colonies who sent delegates to the Continental Congress. And it was a representative body, and it had been elected. All of the members had been. They elected 2 per county at the time. So that's how he got there. They all knew him, and actually in the second election, he comes in second, just behind Peyton Randolph. So he's still climbing.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go back to these colonial years before the Revolution, and there's a figure that jumped out in your book. The narrative that you tell introduces me to a man named Adam Stephen. And he's a new window into George Washington's emergence as the George Washington that we know. And I think probably lots of people here maybe have come across that name or have never heard of him. Introduce us to Adam Stephen. Tell us a little bit about how he helped you understand the emergence of a political George Washington.
Kevin, I looked at my notes before driving over here, and I got to the part about Adam Stephen, and I said to myself, he'll never ask about Adam Stephen. Stephen was a Scot who had medical training and had been a physician on a Royal Navy ship, and signs up with the Virginia Regiment early on and becomes, he's got his own recruited bunch of soldiers and joins the Virginia Regiment and is Washington's number 2. And they're very close. Stephen, as near as I can tell, there's one biography of him in some correspondence that survives, was a smart guy. He wrote some analysis of frontier warfare that was spot on, actually. Just about how bad the British and the Virginians were at it. And when Washington leaves the Virginia Regiment, he succeeds to the position as commander, and things go south between them. The remaining officers don't like Stephen. They start telling stories about him stealing or being corrupt, and Washington plainly believes them. And he actually is party to, it's a complicated setting, so I'm not going to work through it, to a House of Burgesses investigation of a number of officers, including Stephen. And the others are all excused, and Stephen is not. and he takes a hit from the House of Burgesses. And from the 200 years later, you can look at it and say, oh man, that's got Washington's footprint and fingerprints all over it, that he delivered the blow. Stephen was a resilient fellow, though. And in the Revolutionary War, he gets back into the Army, into the Continental Army, and serves again and becomes, I may get it wrong, but I think he was a major general. He is again crosswise with Washington. He must have had support in the Congress. That was one way to get high office in the Army. And I think it was Brandywine or Germantown, I forget which battle, but Stephen is supposed to show up with his troops at a certain point, and he doesn't get there in time. And then his troops like fire on other Continental Army troops, and it's a real botch. And previously, Washington has been scolding him over various things, but this tears it, and there's a court-martial, and Stephen is basically driven out of the Army. So he's a bit of a nemesis. He keeps turning up. He's one of those fellows who just didn't get along with Washington. There were a couple of people like that who we don't remember usually because George tended to do away with his rivals and not leave a lot of fingerprints.
So your new biography of Washington, it takes us all the way through his life, like I said at the beginning, from cradle to grave. But there's a lot of, I think, really fresh emphasis on these colonial years leading up to the Revolution. But the Revolution itself, you actually spend some time in. Obviously, it's an important set of 8 years in Washington's life. But also, you choose. You want to choose a few moments to really focus on to look at the political maturation of George Washington and what lessons he learned from the past and the ways that he's applying them in the Revolutionary period. Tell us a little bit about how you read the Commander-in-Chief years, that is the 8 years as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army for George Washington. What do you see there as the great political moments in Washington's experience?
Yeah, I picked on the Valley Forge winter because he had a couple of political challenges there that were serious. One was what has come to us as the Conway Cabal, which was a group of very senior officers, beginning with Horatio Gates, who really thought Washington would be better if he wasn't commander-in-chief, and if Gates was. And they begin to maneuver to energize this entity called the Board of War to take over, to be a superior entity and to be the vehicle to get Gates into that job. Washington learns about this, and unlike the young Washington back in the French and Indian War, who would have fired off 16 sarcastic letters and, been in high dudgeon, Washington just sits quietly and he waits. I'm sure he has his staff and other people primed to follow up, and he builds stronger and stronger connections to Congress, because Congress controls the Army. They don't always exercise it, but they are the superior body. And this meshes really well with the other thing he needs to do, which is to restructure the Army, and particularly its supply services, which have completely broken down. And that's why there's so much starvation, illness, and death at Valley Forge. And in order to make both of these things happen, he actually is able to get Congress to send a committee of 6 delegates to Valley Forge, and they're in residence for 6 or 7 weeks. They can see how terrible things are. They can see how Washington is working and trying. He gets to work his personality on them. Gates is off in northern New York. They have no idea what he's doing. And he wins their confidence, which was, as I keep saying, his great gift. He wins many reforms to the Army's supply services, which he needed, but he also wins the struggle with the Conway Cabal, which turns out not to be much of a struggle. And it's named for the the least significant member of it, which was General Conway. And the really dangerous fellow was this fellow, Thomas Mifflin, who was to become governor of Pennsylvania and had been head of the Quartermaster Corps. And ultimately, Washington just sails through it. And he allows the conspirators basically to enough rope to hang themselves. They create this really nutty invasion plan for Canada. Invading Canada in the winter kept seeming like a good idea to the Americans. And Benedict Arnold had pretty well disproved that theory in 1775, but they resurrected it and they actually tried to get Lafayette to lead it. And Lafayette got to Lake Champlain and said, you know, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And, you know, Lafayette was 22 years old. So it was a very measured, careful, deft performance. He didn't make enemies. He didn't take these guys on directly, but he did make their effort basically just fall.
Do you have a sense in this revolutionary period? I know that historians are looking at Washington's emerging and obviously changing ideas about the institution of slavery, often focus on the Revolutionary years, a period where he's beginning to see a new perspective on the institution, on race in America. What did you learn as you were working on this biography on Washington's emerging, changing ideas, particularly on the institution of slavery and on racial equality?
Yeah, it's the unavoidable question. It's the topic we have. Until the war, I could find little evidence that he had any second thoughts about slavery. It was part of the world, and it's how he was going to make Mount Vernon a success, and so he wanted those people to work hard. He does change during the war years, and he's not a guy who was confessional and would write, a note to himself, Hamilton made a lot of sense today, I'm going to change my views on slavery. But he was in the company of people like Hamilton and Lafayette, who actually harangued him about slavery, that it was an outrage that the general should allow himself to be part of it. And John Lawrence from South Carolina. And he saw he was exposed to more. He'd been a Virginia guy, and that was the culture in Virginia. Also, though, you have to give credit to the soldiers, the African-American soldiers who volunteered and risked their lives, gave their lives in many instances, suffered terribly. He always felt the sacrifices of his soldiers. I can't remember the phrase exactly, my proud boys or something like that. And it was just impossible to see these sacrifices, to live with these men who were dying for his liberty and not think it is a crime to own these people. And I think he did come to that conclusion. He initially decided he'd be a good slave owner. He discovered that being a good slave owner was an oxymoron. You just couldn't do that. So he spends a lot of time in his late years trying to get out of being a slave owner in ways that aren't that uncomfortable for him. He's not a total idealist. And he never can fix that.
There's a question, actually, I'm seeing some questions now coming in from the room in front of us, from the note cards. And there's a question from a 12-year-old named Claire that asks a question that I think is related to this, but may not be. Well, obviously it is, but I want you to expand on it beyond the subject we just discussed. What is your personal opinion of George Washington? What did you come away with after diving into him for a couple, 3, however many years you worked on this project? How do you feel about him? What is your take on him in your personal opinion?
Well, it feels a little simple-minded, but I thought he was amazing. I think we were, and I do say this at one point in the book, we were incredibly lucky that he was the person who became the leader of our revolution and our independence movement. You look at a lot of countries, and the person who becomes the leader is often someone who really likes power and just gets addicted to it and sort of loses the principles. You know, Napoleon, Oliver Cromwell, it's a long list. And Washington was not that person. He was a tenacious soldier and military figure, a tough fighter, but you know, when he had done the job, he wanted to go home, and he was not addicted to power. He understood power extremely well, but it was his ability to walk away from it which amazed his contemporaries. When he resigns from the Continental Army at the end of the war and goes home, it's the classic story, as King George III said, if that's true, he obviously didn't quite believe it, he's the greatest man in the world. And then after 2 terms as president, he goes home. He doesn't hang around. It's not that important to him. In fact, my view is he didn't even want to serve the 2nd term, but he got talked into it. So I think the mix of great leadership abilities, great political skill, and a certain modesty and lack of lust for power were just a fabulous combination for us. He's not without problems. He had a terrible temper, and he made some mistakes. We all do, and the slavery sandpit he got stuck in, he never got out of.
Another question coming from the room that relates, I think, nicely to leadership is this question of military leadership and military strategy. As you looked at the 2 wars in which Washington fought, and maybe there's lessons learned in the first that change how he approaches the second. I think that's certainly true politically, perhaps militarily. But what do you see as his strengths and weaknesses as a military leader?
His greatest strength was his bond with his soldiers. He had the gift of inspiring men to serve, who were not being paid, who were not being fed well, who were not being clothed well. The suffering that they went through was truly epic, and so many of them stuck it out. And a lot of that was because he was able to inspire them. At Valley Forge, every day he rode around the camp and he got the horse carcasses moved out, and he cleaned things. He cared, and they felt it and cared, and they cared back. The military geniuses have written at great length about his overfondness for complicated battle plans, and there was some of that. When he first took over the Continental Army, he seemed really eager for big battles against the British Army, which were a uniquely bad idea, and accounts for all the trouble he had at the Battle of New York. But he learned. He learned that, in fact, and Nathaniel Greene's got a great quote about this, that the British can control a city, and maybe even 2 or 3 cities, but they can't control the country. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to survive. And the last 3 or 4 years of the war, that's really all Washington is doing. He strikes at Yorktown when he has a chance. He's desperate to do that, and he's obviously delirious that he can. But much of the time, he's just not doing something stupid, which is, good leadership.
I'm going to ask one more question on the war years. Maybe we'll come back to it, but there's another question from the room about Washington and his relationship with Lafayette. The question is, what did he learn from Lafayette? We've already touched briefly on the question of slavery and race. What else did he learn from the Marquis?
It's a hard question because I don't know Lafayette as a figure as well as I should. I do think there's no question that Lafayette was his surrogate son. We've got popular culture has been telling us for a few years that it was Hamilton. It wasn't Hamilton. They got along okay. They fought at times, and and they did great things together. But the person who moved Washington personally was Lafayette, and it just, you click with some people, you fall in love, and I think that is what happened. And Washington takes in Lafayette's son when Lafayette is in prison in Europe. He has an extraordinary connection with him, and I think he touched Washington's heart. And I think Washington was so open to that because he'd had such a difficult relationship with his stepson, Martha's son by her first marriage, Jack Custis, who endlessly frustrated Washington because he was not a very serious fellow. He was extremely rich and didn't take things very seriously. And I think Washington was just so excited to be dealing with this young fellow who was so admirable and who would listen to him.
Well, let's move away from the years of the war, and I imagine, because I'm fascinated by the 1780s, we'll spend a little more time back there in the period before he becomes president, before we're done. But let's go to the presidency, because Alan Kimball from Facebook has a question about Washington as president and his embrace of Hamilton's vision, and not Jefferson's, which was somewhat less activist and certainly more deferential to the states. Talk to us a little bit about why Alan's question is, why did he choose Hamilton over Jefferson in this case? Talk to us a little bit about Washington's understanding of what to do with his presidency and why it seems to veer so closely to Alexander Hamilton's vision.
It's an interesting thing that this fellow who was at Washington, who spent all his time building this wonderful estate and this agricultural juggernaut, really was fascinated by technology and factories and manufacturing, which was just sort of becoming was the new technology of the time. And I think he was at heart a capitalist and, dare I say it, a New Englander. Whenever he went to New England, his first trip there, he didn't get along with them too well, but when he went there as president, he was just so impressed with, how clean their cities were and how hard they worked and how good their farms looked. And I think he was a bit critical of Virginians and Southerners for not having that those talents. And so I think Hamilton and he had very similar ideas. Hamilton's financial ideas were more sophisticated than Washington. He did not have a great understanding of how banks worked and that sort of thing. But what Hamilton wanted to do, which was to build trade and to build a manufacturing base, was exactly what Washington thought was the important thing to do. So they were the natural pairing. And Jefferson's notion of a nation of small farmers and yeomen, we were going to be that anyway for a while. That's just how the world was. But I don't think it inspired Washington the same way.
I don't want to keep pairing off Washington with individuals, but another question has come in from this room about Washington's relationship with George Mason. And I think it's an interesting one because it takes us to the colonial period, or at least the run up to the Revolution. How much did Mason influence Washington's political development is part of the question. And then talk to us a bit about the fallout from Mason's ultimate failure to embrace and support the Constitution of 1787.
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship, and there's a really fine article by Peter Henricus about it. And he concludes, and I think correctly, that they never were that close. They're neighbors right next door to each other. And if you track it, which I did both for my first book on the summer of 1787 and this one, Mason is always sending, grafts of cherry trees and stuff to help Washington out, and Washington pretty much never sends anything back. It's a very one-sided relationship. Washington is always complaining about their boundary lines, that, Mason is taking land that's not his. They do a couple of trades of land because Washington was always trying to expand Mount Vernon. Mason is 7 years older, so that may have been created a certain tension in the relationship. And he was a very smart and intellectual guy. They were a great partnership in the run-up to the Revolution here in Fairfax County, particularly in drafting the Fairfax Resolves, which was something that was a very key step for Washington's advancement in public notice. And Washington, this is not a new insight, but he always liked to hook up with somebody who was really good with the pen, because he didn't have the confidence in his own abilities to write. No, he didn't really hang out with political theory a lot. And so Mason played that role for him. And they were, in that period, extremely close. Although then there's tension, They have to front some of the money for the new militia, and then they have to collect it from residents, and Washington is grumpy that he thinks Mason has gotten all the money before he could ask for it. And it's never easy. Then, of course, Mason stays home most of the time. He had ill health, and he just hated to leave home. So he doesn't participate in Congress during the Revolutionary War. Washington is annoyed by that. He thinks Mason should be pulling his oar. And then at the Constitutional Convention, they come together again. They work together for about half of the convention, and then Mason falls off the bus and doesn't like the Constitution and ultimately refuses to sign it. And that's it. Washington is done. He's tired of this guy, and he refers to him once, I think, as my quondam friend, which the Latin dictionary tells me means my one-time friend, which doesn't sound very good. He thought Mason failed to come up to the mark when he should have.
So I was all set to follow this up with a boring question on my own design, but one just came in from Ivan Pierce on Facebook, and I'm blown away by this. I mentioned, Ivan says...
This isn't Adam Stephen again, right?
No, well, it could be. I don't know. I'm interested in hearing the dirty side of Washington's political tactics. If we're talking about Washington as a great politician, certainly there's something nasty, a little bit dirty about his approach at some point. So Ivan suggests. What would you say if someone wants to understand the nitty gritty of Washington's political tactics? What might you throw out there?
Well, what's dirty? It's a question. I grew up in a household where the head of Tammany Hall came over for dinner, so we have a broad definition in my family. Adam Stephen, I think, is an example of a guy who Washington took off the field twice. The Conway cabal, he didn't do anything dirty there, but he certainly was out to do those guys in, and he did. There's also, out of the Battle of Monmouth, General Charles Lee, who was the second general in the Army, his number 2. He had been a prisoner of the British for a year and had done this amazing thing where he gave them a plan for how to beat the Americans, and then they exchanged him, and then he resumes his service in the Continental Army. He's a very odd fellow. And Lee at Monmouth does not satisfy Washington, and Washington lets it go for a day, and then Lee demands to be court-martialed, and Washington gives him his request. And there's no question that the officers were picked as Washington loyalists who were going to drum Lee out of the army, and they do. So opposing Washington was a short-term strategy. It usually didn't end well. I spend a lot of time talking about, as president, the deal between the national capital and Hamilton's financial plan. And I don't think there was anything dirty there, but there was definitely a lot of horse trading that went on. And I think Washington was at the center of it. And, there are people who think that's dirty. Well, I don't. But if you're looking for somebody who was willing to wheel and deal, he was.
Thank you. That's exciting stuff. And there's all kinds of questions that might take us into those kinds of, not the dirtier side, but the more in the mix side of politics for Washington. But let me jump back. I got a couple of questions that take us well outside of politics that are coming in from the audience. R. Sherrard has a question about Washington and surveying. How did he learn to do this? Maybe you can give us a little thumbnail sketch of that. And then I might add on, how does that shape his life? How does being a surveyor shape Washington's approach?
Not sure I can do the second one, but the first one I can do. He teaches himself, and surveyors were usually self-taught at this time. And we had this huge continent, and people wanted to chop it up into sections and sell it. So you needed surveyors. He becomes a surveyor largely for the money. His father has died when he's 11. His mother is raising him and his 4 younger siblings with not much assets. And they're not living terribly well. They don't live here. They live at Ferry Farm down across from Fredericksburg. And Washington is chafing under his mother's control. And he decides he's going to become a surveyor and make some dough, which was a good thing to do. Jefferson's father had started out as a surveyor. Patrick Henry's father had started out as a surveyor. It was for ambitious people in the lower gentry, it was an entry point. The thing that struck me about the surveying profession at the time was it was not highly ethical. And it was very standard. It was fascinating to read about for surveyors to sort of add a little extra land for their client at the expense of whoever was next door. So the story of Virginia development and also American development is land arguments, and there are broad statements which I think are true, which is there were actually no sound land titles in America because everybody was basically cheating. There's no particular reason to think Washington stood out in that crowd, but he certainly was aware that was how the game was played. There's
a question I would never ask anyone, but I think you. I'll trust you to answer this question. It's a question coming from this room about moving legislation through Congress. We're looking at Washington as someone who has good political instincts, learned a lot along the way. What do you think Washington would think about politics today in that process of moving legislation into law in our own context today? Would Washington have any reaction that you could share with us today that isn't going to upset anyone in the room?
Well, I'm going to upset somebody, I'm sure. But Washington is a man of contradictions on this subject. Okay. He matured in the House of Burgesses in a context where there were no parties. There was no partisanship. And Congress, through the Revolutionary War, doesn't have parties. Right. And there are really no parties in his first term. Out of the Constitution, you had contest between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, but that doesn't carry over. But towards the end of his first term, and definitely in the second term, there's a lot of partisanship, and it's very bitter. The Democratic Republicans want to support France. The Federalists want to line up with Britain. And Washington is drawn into it. He doesn't want to be part of it, but he is part of it. And he becomes, in my view, partisan. He didn't want to be, but he was, and did some things that you can only justify as the acts of a partisan. And he knew how to play the game. And he had to get the big example that's in the book is the ratification of the Jay Treaty, which was going to get beat. But rather than allow it to go before the Senate and get defeated, or actually the key vote was going to be in the House, he sat on it, and he sat on it, and he sat on it, and he waited for public opinion to move. And sure enough, it finally moved. And it goes through by the skin of its teeth, like 2 votes. And this is to fund the activities to implement the treaty. And the one lesson I can draw from that, maybe for today, is if you want to do a deal in Congress, if you want to get something through, change public opinion. And, the congressman, in theory, will listen to their constituents.
We're coming towards the end of our time, and I see an opportunity for you to sign some books for our audience here. I know that our audience around the country can purchase books through the Mount Vernon shops, and I think we could sell signed copies, although I should have checked on that before I say that, but I think that's something we could sell.
I signed 80 book plates.
Thank you. Okay, we could sell signed copies. Thank you, Dave. And obviously, you could sign some books here tonight. So we're coming up to the end of our time, but one thing I want to ask, it's a big question, but I think it's a good way to close. Why, a few years ago, or whenever you started this process, why did you decide to write this book? What was it that led you to want to write a book about the rise of America's founding father and his changing way of thinking about the world? Why did you dive into this topic?
There were really 2 reasons. One is I'd done 3 books in the founding era, and whenever I spoke about them in places like this, people would always say, so who was the most important guy? And I'd say, well, Washington. And after you do that 8 or 10 or 12 times, you start thinking to yourself, well, maybe I'm missing the point. And maybe I should look at that guy. And so that really was part of it, was I thought I'd really like to understand him better. And I got onto the political theme from something that lots of people have noticed, which was he had 4 key elections in his life as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, as President of the Constitutional Convention, then as President twice. Of course, he wins them, but he wins them unanimously. That's hard. That was hard in the 18th century. And, you don't do that with box tops. And it seemed to me that, we think of Washington as this giant guy on a horse, winning battles and being majestic. But he was the central political figure in our country for the first 20 years of our existence. How did that happen? How was he able to do that? And that's what I was hoping to try to unpack.
Well, thank you to all of you here tonight. Thank you to everyone around the country. Thank you, David Stewart.
Thanks very much.